So again, what are you afraid of? Like in life, like apparently my very greatest fear is that I get the wrong sermon. Like I have nightmares about that. So we're going to call this the will of God in this moment, I guess. But what are you afraid of? Like I'm not talking about, are you afraid of spiders? Are you afraid of lightning? I mean, that's fine. But what are you really afraid of? Like, what is that thing in your life that you would like to do, but you won't do it because you're afraid? You're afraid of what might happen. You're afraid of what people will say. You're afraid that I'll start down that road and I won't know what else to do. Or what were you afraid of? What did you never do? And now it feels like it might be too late to do it. Right? Because the greatest regrets we have in our lives are not the things that we do and fail. Overwhelmingly, the greatest regrets we have in our lives are the things we never tried to do. So again, what are you afraid of? Because I think so much of the struggle that we have in life, so much of what we miss out on in life is because we are afraid. We're afraid what's going to happen. And what do we end up with? If we never do things that scare us a little bit, we end up with a life that goes one of two ways. Either we are just always just trying to get to the next thing, get to the end of the day, get to the weekend, get to my next paycheck. We're just trying to get somewhere. Or we're just trying to survive. You know what? I come into it, and today, I hate today, but I'll get through today, and I'll wake up tomorrow, and tomorrow will look just like today, right? That's kind of the choices we have if we never step out and we never try things. And we feel like that's what life has to look like. But as we've been talking about throughout this series, right, the series that we've been in for the past few weeks, this idea of what's got your attention, the priorities that we set in our lives heavily impact the kind of life we have. It impacts how we experience our lives. And then one of the things we've seen is that Jesus says that life doesn't have to be like that. Jesus at least seems to believe that there's another version of life available. Right? Because we looked at this verse each week. Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Now, another way to read that is Jesus has come so that you can have life and have it to the full. That I can have life and have it to the full. So Jesus seems to say that in relationship with him, there is a way to live our lives that is something that is not about survival, that is not just about getting through another day, but is a life that's full. And remember that when we kicked this series off, we kind of really dug into this particular statement, right? Remembering that the Bible was not written in English, right? The New Testament, most of it was written in a version of ancient Greek. And the original text of this, when Jesus says, I've come that you may have life, he used a very specific word, a very specific Greek word for life, which is this word zoe. And the word zoe is a divine life, a God-given life, a life that is inherently complete and full and satisfying. And Jesus says that I have come that I may have that kind of life. And so throughout the series, what I've encouraged each of us to do is to think about the priorities we have in our lives. Like, what are the things that are really high on our list or low on our lists? And when we started out, we talked about some of the things that may have been too high of priorities on our list. Those things that we're chasing after, we think that when we get them, then our lives will feel complete. But then we get them, it turns out that we don't feel complete. They're not that any of those things that we talked about were bad, but they shouldn't be the main thing. And then we talked about something that I think is really important to prioritize, that I think we struggle to prioritize, which is the act of being present. Being present in everything we do. Being where you are when you are there. Right? Being present with yourself. Right? Being present with the people in your life, the people around you. Being present in our world and just being aware of what's happening. Right? And being present in our relationship with God. And when we're present in all those things, now we're having a whole life, an active life, a life that we are really participating in. And then last week, we talked about something else I would encourage us to prioritize. Dealing with the things that have a hold on us. The hurts from our past that we've never dealt with. The pain that we're struggling through that we've never dealt with. Right? The addiction, the dangerous behaviors, all those things that we may have in our lives, because we're never going to really live the life that we could live as long as something else has a hold of us. And then something that I've hoped that we would see throughout this entire series, and I kind of kept hitting this point, is to recognize that you were created on purpose with a purpose, that embrace the fact that your life has meaning, that God actually has a plan for your life, and that God wants to work through your life to make a huge difference in this world. And see, all these things work together to create that kind of life like Jesus talks about. Right? That's where we find that from, right? It's not just kind of one thing. It's all these pieces work together. And it's all those things that kind of lead us towards that Zoe kind of life. And as I describe this, I think that most of us, in the abstract, sitting around having a cup of coffee, talking, going, wow, that sounds exciting. That sounds really cool. I would love to have a rich, full life like that. And then we walk out the door and we forget everything I've said. I don't take it personally, by the way, but maybe a little bit. But the reality is that, why does that happen? And I would like to argue, not be argumentative, but argue the point that a big piece of that is fear. Virtually everything we do in our lives that makes our life less is driven by fear. Right? We're not present because we're afraid of what it feels like to be present. We have dangerous behaviors because it distracts us, because we're afraid to be in our reality, deal with the realities of life. And so often we don't try things because we're afraid. We're afraid of what might happen. We're afraid of what people might think. And I think a big one is we're afraid we're going to start down a path and not know how to finish it. And as a result, we get stuck. We just get stuck and we never go anywhere. And as much as we may complain about the way life is, we never do anything to really change it. So I think the way forward is to be willing to face fear. Be willing to take the journey that you can. And I understand that this idea of kind of embracing this life like Jesus describes, it can sound kind of daunting, right? Because there's a lot of pieces to it. But a rich life is made up of many things, right? A rich life is not just about yourself, but also a rich life is not just about sacrificing all the time and just focusing on others, because we'll collapse eventually if we do that, right? A rich life is about bringing all those things together. It's about addressing the changes that we've talked about and doing the things that we need to do to get free and to be present and to feel fulfilled. And it's about investing in the lives of others and to recognize that Jesus calls us to live out a life like that, to connect with people, to lift them up in their suffering or from their suffering, that when you embrace a relationship with Jesus, to be willing to share that when the right time comes along. And it's about really being active and engaged in our own lives. And if we're going to live this kind of life like Jesus describes, the important thing to understand is that it actually is a journey, right? That you're called towards something, you're called to do something, you're called to make a difference in a specific way. And in order to do that, to take any journey, what's the first thing you have to do, right? You actually have to take a step towards something. And I think one of the things that often kind of keeps us from really getting into the journey is they say that, okay, I think there's something here I could do, but it's so small. Like just volunteering somewhere. That's so small, right? What could happen there? But it's a step. Right? It's showing up when the opportunity presents itself. It's just a step. It's a neighbor who's struggling with something that you can be an ear to listen, or you can provide a hand or something. But we never do those things because we're like, well, where is that road going to lead? I mean, this is such a small step, a small beginning. Like, what could it ever lead to something deeper in my life? Which leads me to one of my favorite verses, as I promised would come along. It comes from the Old Testament book of Zechariah. You guys are big Zechariah fans, right? Woohoo! Go Zechariah, right? So it's actually kind of a less commonly read book, but some of you might recognize the verse. The verse says, "Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin." See, I think one of our big struggles in our lives is that we crave certainty. Life doesn't come with certainty. A meaningful life, an impactful life, unfortunately, is filled with uncertainty. So what we do is that we have to make a choice. Are we going to let uncertainty keep us from making a journey at all? Or are we going to be willing to say that, you know what, I'm going to do this one small thing. And when I do this one small thing, how is it possibly going to end up anywhere? And how is it really going to matter when I help this person out, or I step into that person's life, or I kind of step up to volunteer for something or be part of something? How is that ever going to matter? I mean, can anything really good happen from one small step? And I would argue that great outcomes almost always start with one small step. And to put that in context, I want to read the rest of this verse. It says, "Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin, to see the plumb line in Zerubbabel's hand." Clears it all up, right? Who's Zerubbabel? Where'd he come from? I thought this was Zechariah, right? This is a really, really powerful verse if you put it in context. You recall about, okay, I'm gonna ask you guys to remember something I said like a month ago. I'm gonna narrow it down to a whole series. If you remember being here at any point in a 4-week window about a month and a half ago, this shouldn't be too hard. Remember we were going through the book of Nehemiah, right? And remember what did Nehemiah do? Right, that he felt this urge in his life to help out the people who had returned to this ancient city, right? It was the ancient city of Jerusalem, right? So this is like 2,500 years ago, 500 years before the time of Jesus. And the city had been destroyed because the nation had been overrun by an invader, was now under the control of a foreign king. And remember that Nehemiah led this effort to kind of rebuild the city. Well, it turns out that the rebuilding of that entire city happened over decades. And decades before the time of Nehemiah, there were other people who were concerned about the ancient city. That same city, that same ancient city of Jerusalem, when it was destroyed by the invaders, they didn't just destroy the buildings, they destroyed the temple. The ancient temple. That in ancient Judaism, the temple was the center of worship. Without a temple, they didn't really have a concept of how they were supposed to worship God. So decades before the time of Nehemiah, a small group of people returned to that city. And they say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to restore the temple. Now keep in mind, if you know the story of the temple, the first temple, the original temple, was a massive construction project involving many, many, many people. And here's this small group of people saying that, well, we're going to rebuild the temple. And I'm sure that there were lots of people who had said, you're not going to rebuild the temple. I mean, great plan, dude, right? And there's one guy who's leading the group is a guy named Zerubbabel. And notice it says that God rejoices to see the plumb line in Zerubbabel's hand. Right, a plumb line, also called a plumb bob sometimes, is one of the simplest tools in existence. It is a string with a weight on the end. But it gives you a perfectly vertical line. It gives you a plumb line, right? In other words, it allows your walls to be plumb or be straight up and down. And so what this is saying is that we're at the point in the project where they're doing nothing but planning. They're just laying out what they're going to do. They haven't even begun to build yet. And what does the verse say? What does it say about how God reacts to it? The Lord rejoices to see the work begin. God rejoices to see the work begin because everything we do that matters has to begin somewhere, and it's almost always small. But small things added together end up with big outcomes. Right? The Bible is filled with narratives of people, very small groups of people coming together, taking a small step that has huge outcomes. And if we look around our lives, if you look at people who have found success, professional success, success in organizations they've created, outreach organizations, these things almost always start with something small. But we keep waiting for something bigger to happen, that we keep saying that, well, when I finally see the big picture all the way through, then I'll start taking the step. And the thing is that it really comes down to action, right? From doing the thing that we can do. And now you might hear my little story there and go, yeah, cool story, dude. They at least knew what they were building. They were building a temple. I'm not even sure what I'm building. But see, I think we do know what we're building. I know what I'm trying to build. Right? I believe that for all of us, our general destination is the same. That we're trying to achieve this kind of life like Jesus describes. I mean, do you want a full, meaningful, fulfilling life that not only fulfills you by what you do, but fulfills you by what you do for others? I certainly do. Right? So when we see that as our general target, we go, well, I don't know exactly what I'm building, but I kind of know where I'm heading. I know what I'm trying to achieve. So take a step that actually leads us in that direction. But we never really seem to get there. And again, I think that at the heart of it is fear. We're just afraid. And as I kind of, mentioned in the beginning, I experience those things too. I'm afraid a lot. I'm concerned about the choices I make. I'm concerned about, am I doing the things that help us to do the most that we can? Am I doing the things that impact your life well? Am I writing a message that's worth listening to? Right? I struggle with those things all the time. And one of the things that I have that strengthens me a bit is this picture. And this is a gift that Bonnie gave me some Christmases ago. It says, "Be strong and courageous, for the Lord is with you wherever you go." Now, that's a paraphrasing of a verse from the Old Testament, from the book of Joshua. And the full verse goes like this. It's Joshua 1:9. It says, "This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." Do not be afraid or discouraged. You're not alone. God is with you. That we are called to be strong and courageous. We are called to be bold. We are called to step out even when we're scared. And the beauty of this verse is the reason it exists. This book, again, comes from the book of Joshua. Joshua is from the Old Testament. Right? It's basically, you got kind of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which are the creation story and the story of the ancient Hebrews, that Moses guy you may have heard of a little bit. Right? Now, and even if you've never read a Bible, you've seen Charlton Heston. Right? Every Easter, Charlton Heston's out there. Moses, right? Joshua was one of the people with Moses. So as they're on this journey, because God had delivered a promise to them, God has said that I have a place for you. I am promising you a better life, a life that is full and rich. And if you will go to the place I will tell you, you will find it. And that journey took a very long time. And Joshua was actually like Moses' assistant, like one of his closest assistants. And everyone thought that Moses was going to be the guy that led them all the way to that life that God had promised. But as they started to finally get into the region where they would get where they were heading, Moses dies. And now suddenly, Joshua was the man in charge. And Joshua was like, I thought Moses was doing this. But now it's up to me. And Joshua has to decide what he's going to do. Is he going to do the best he can? Because Joshua doesn't know exactly where they're going. He knows generally where they're heading. That it's somewhere in this region, and somewhere in that region, God has promised them a path to a life that is rich and full and meaningful. Sound familiar? And so Joshua says, I don't really know how to get here. Here's what I do know. I know the journey will be challenging. It will be frightening at times. It will be discouraging at times. And we are never explicitly told that Joshua is afraid, but I'm going to say the fact that this command was necessary says that Joshua felt afraid at points. So Joshua realizes that I have a choice. I can stay here afraid and never go anywhere, or I can do what I can. I know generally which direction I have to head. And so he's like, we're going to go that way. And the people around him saying that, we're going to go that way? Do you know what is that way? Because along that way, there's this great big river that's always hard to cross. But given the time of year it is right now, the rains have been falling heavily. And the river's not just full, the river is overflowing and it's rushing. It's a rushing tide. And we want to go that way? And Joshua says, yeah, I believe God's going to make a way for us to get there. So now the people can say, okay, well, if God's going to make a way, why don't we pull up a chair, kick back, and as soon as we see that way, we'll go. We laugh, but how often do we do that? You know, when I can see the whole path, when God delivers his great epiphany, I'm going to follow. No. For whatever reason, God calls us to have faith. He calls us to take the journey that we can. So basically, Joshua says, we're going to go. And here's the instructions. As we begin, it says, and when you reach the banks of the Jordan River, take a few steps into the river and stop there. In other words, you're right. There is a raging, rushing river there. And God says, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to walk as far as you can. And notice it isn't just walk up to the edge of the river where it's still safe and dry. It's like take a few steps in. Notice it does not say rush in like an idiot, right? It doesn't say go blindly, just keep going. It says, no, I want you to kind of just take a step of faith. I want you to be willing to be a little bit afraid in this. I want you to have to trust me a little bit in this journey. And so as they wade out into the water, they wait and look around. And the path of the water begins to change. And a path that seemed unpassable became passable. So basically, they begin in there, they get into it, they take this step, a first few scary steps. And they would have many more scary things along the way. But ultimately, they knew generally where they were trying to get to. And in the case of Joshua and his people, it was that willingness to begin the journey, to go as far as they could, be willing to be afraid for a bit, that they ultimately found the life that God had promised them. And that same promise is available to us. This is the thing we're talking about. Jesus says that here's a life that you can have. You know generally which way to go. Go as far as you can see. Because here's a funny thing that happens when you're on a long journey. When you go as far as you can see, what happens when you get there? You'll see a little bit further. That next step doesn't always show up the instant we would like it to, but it's always there eventually. And what I want to encourage us with is that to recognize that just like this played out in the life of Joshua, this is the same journey for us. That I believe that so many of these Old Testament stories lay out the picture for us of what this journey looks like. You know, whether it's the ancient Hebrews or it's, the time of Jesus, the promise of God is that there is a path to a life that is full and meaningful. And it is a scary journey sometimes. And if we just sit back and wait, we're never going to see it. We got to do the things that we can. And for most of us, the path forward is something that we can discover. Again, I make that joke about waiting for this big epiphany from God, but the reality is the way God generally moves on us is to move on our hearts. Right? It's a simple nudge. It's a bit of discontent. Right? You notice something happening in the world and you're like, things shouldn't be like that. I could do something about that. People who are being forgotten or missed. You're saying things shouldn't be like that. I could do something about that. I could at least go volunteer somewhere. So often we'll say, I'm going to create this whole great big organization and I'll build this whole thing out. That stuff rarely works. But you volunteer somewhere for a while and you learn a bit more about what you're doing, and then maybe you do something more then. And maybe eventually you do construct your own organization that solves a particular problem, that serves a particular need, that reaches particular people. But the journey is the steps that we can take. Right? That somehow it is safer and easier to put together a massive plan that I can never really undertake than it is to do one simple thing that's right in front of me. Right? Because dreaming is safe. Showing up is hard and heavy and challenging and worth it. It's worth it. But we need to get past our fear, right? That living this kind of life always involves stretching ourselves. And so just to kind of wrap up everything we've talked about over the past few weeks, is that to recognize the fact that this is a multi-part journey, that all the things we've talked about, and then finally you just need to take the step. And so the question really is, and this is kind of one of the last things I'll say. I have two more things to say, this and one more. One of the last things I'll say, if you want to make a difference, if you want to have this kind of life like Jesus describes, where do you start? I will tell you a story. If you go back in my life 20 years, which is way longer ago than I thought I could ever talk about, I didn't believe virtually any of this. I didn't believe Christianity was real. I believed a guy named Jesus probably lived at some point, but that was it. And then through a series of experiences, I've started to kind of believe, started to wonder, started to kind of believe, finally started to believe. Until one day I find myself sitting in a church in Florida. And some people who I had a lot of respect for invited Bonnie and I over to their house for dinner. And it was actually a number of people they had invited over, a number of people who were deeply, one guy had been a minister in New York City for like 50 years, like no kidding. He literally organized one of Billy Graham's crusades, like seriously, he's actually that kind of guy. Another person involved in international missions. And as we go there, another couple is a literal couple, I am not making this up, who gave up their lives, moved to Africa, created a brand new orphanage, constructed the orphanage, built a school, like literally this is their life. And I'm like, I just got here, I just don't really remember. I don't really get much of this stuff. And I was listening to just their their conversation was so amazing to hear. The things that they were doing, the things they were experiencing, the things they were seeing. And I said, man, I wish I could just do something kind of like that. But I'm a mess. By the way, I'm still a mess, right? But I'm a mess. And one of the guys said, the husband and the couple who had launched the thing in Africa, said, you got to understand, you're exactly where you're supposed to be right now. And so the place to start is right where you are. See, we keep looking for this thing down the road, this thing down the line. The truth is the answer is right here, right now. We just need to choose to do it. So the last thing I want to say here is there's this verse from the Apostle Paul that actually says, now all glory to God who is able through his mighty power at work within us to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think. See, the thing to recognize is that the great things we do in our lives are not entirely in our own power. It's a willingness to surrender our lives, to turn it over to God, to follow his leading, right? To embrace a journey of faith, putting our faith in Jesus, but recognizing that that's not the end point, that's the beginning. And now we start to do the work that he empowers us to do. And God invites us to be part of his incredible activities, his incredible work. But we have to choose to do it. And that's what Paul is wrapping up for us here. God is inviting you to do something beyond your imagination. But it starts with that first step, exactly where you are right now.